We'll say we're continuing in today's Mishna Yomi, and we find ourselves in Maseches Peah, Perek Gimel, chapter 3, and today's Mishnah is our Vav and Zayin 6 and 7. Mishnah Vav says as follows: Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Karka Beis Rava Chayeves Bepeah. Rabbi Eliezer says that if you have land that is large enough to be able to plant literally a quarter of a kav of seeds. If you look at the the Bartanura, he says Makom Shroil is Robo Rova Hakav. So Rabbi Eliezer says, in order for a field to be chayiv in Peah, it has to be a large enough field that you could plant a quarter of a kav of seeds. And again, the Bartanur explains this is a field that is 10 and a half amos by 10 amos. So the idea would be, if you figure that an amma is a foot and a half, so about 15 feet by 15 feet. Rabbi Yeshua says, ha'osas sasayim. Rabbi Yeshua says that the truth is the obligation of Peah is not really dependent on the size of the field, but rather is dependent on the output of the field. So any field that at least produces 2 sa'ah of seeds ultimately will be chayiv in Peah. So an interesting machlokes: do we generate an obligation based on the size of the field, or based on the yield of the field? Rabbi Tarfon Omer shisha al shisha tfachim. Rabbi Tarfon says even a tiny field that is only 6 tfachim by 6 tfachim is enough to generate a Peah obligation. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira Omer kedei liktar v'lishnos. Even if the field is so small that there's only enough. In other words, means that you harvest and there's enough to harvest again. Now the Bartanura explains that normally the way you would harvest was derech hakotzrim oches melo kapo min hakam v'kotzer. When you were harvesting, you would grab a handful of wheat and then you would cut it down with the sickle. So that's how you'd harvest. That's what it means. If there's essentially 2 handfuls of wheat in the field, 2 handfuls of standing crop, that is enough to go ahead and generate a Peah obligation. V'halacha kidvarav. And the Mishnah says that the halacha follows the position of Rabbi Yehuda ben Beseira, that even if the field is so small that all it does is produce a handful of wheat, that there is still a Peah obligation. Rabbi Kiva says, Karka kolshu chayeves bepeah ubebikurim v'lichtov alei pruzbo. So again, let's go through this. Rabbi Kiva says, if you have land of any amount, any small amount of land is going to be chayiv in Peah. Rabbi Akiva holds that halacha l'maisa, any field of any size is chayiv in Peah. Not only that, bikurim, the obligation to bring first fruits, v'lichtov aleh pruzbol. Remember, it's actually very shaykh. The halacha is that Shemitah cancels debts. Now, the way to avoid that is if one goes ahead and hands their debt over to Beis Din, Beis Din has the ability to go ahead and collect that debt. Now, interestingly enough, the halacha is that a pruzbol is only effective if the borrower has land. How much land do you have to have? Any amount of land. Now, there's an interesting idea as well, that halacha l'maisa, you could acquire movable property with non-movable property. Or to say it a little bit differently, if I'm acquiring land, which is non-movable property, I can go ahead and acquire metaltal, movable property, along with the land. How much land does one have to acquire in order to be able to acquire movable property along with it? Land of any size, any amount. Good. So Mishnah Zayin continues along this same theme, and Mishnah Zayin says as follows: now that we established that land of any amount is enough to go ahead and be chayiv in Peah, bikurim is enough to secure the debt for the borrower, to write a pruzbol on it, and to go ahead and serve as the mechanism for acquiring movable property together with the land. Mishnah Zayin says as follows: Hakosev nechasiv shchimira Shir karka kolshuhu matanaso matana. So this is an interesting case. So there's a concept of matna shchivnira. A person is on their deathbed and they want to gift their property. They want to gift their property as a result of their illness. So now here's the interesting question. If somebody goes ahead and gives away their property on their deathbed, so let's say Baruch Hashem then they recover. So the question then becomes, what is the status of the gift? Does the gift still remain in effect? Or do we say that since the person person recovered, the gift is now void. So the Mishnah says something very interesting. It depends. If a person was on his deathbed and he gifted away all of his property, if he maintained even a small amount, minuscule amount of land for himself, then ultimately again, matanoso matana. His gift is a gift. Meaning what? Since he retained some land for himself, the Mishnah understands that it's clear that his gift was not dependent on his death. In other words, he took into account that he may recover. That's why he went ahead and retained some land for his own use. Masha'enkin, whereas lo shir karka kolshu, but if a person gifted away all of his property and he did not maintain any land for himself, and then he recovers from his illness, ein matana so matana, the gift is void. Because the idea is, since he didn't retain anything for himself, he obviously gifted everything away, assuming that he was going to die. So therefore, again, the gift is fundamentally dependent on his imminent death. If he does not die, then by definition, the gift is void. Similarly, the Mishnah says, Hakosev nechasav libanov v'kasav leishto karka kolshu ibda ksubasa. If a man, same idea as a shchiv meira, a person on his deathbed, is going out and dividing up his estate amongst his sons before his actual death, and he goes ahead and he writes a piece of property to his wife. Amongst the stuff that he's giving to his sons, he gives a piece of property to his wife, Ibdak Suvaso, which means that now his wife is aware of what's happening. So by her accepting this piece of property, she gives up her right to any other subsequent ksuva claim. In other words, she heard that her husband was giving her this piece of land. She did not object, or she did not say anything, to indicate her displeasure with this. So therefore, she accepted this land as her payout from the estate. Rabbi Yossi says, Im kibla aleha, afa pishalo kasavla, Ibdak Suvasa. Rabbi Yossi takes this a step further, and he says that Allah Lamaisa, you see, in the first case, the husband's actually papering this agreement, right? He's saying he writes down in a document what he's giving to each of his sons, and he writes down what he has given to his wife. And now she accepts that document. Ultimately, again, she gives up any other rights to any other ksuva payment. However, Rabbi Yossi says, even if he did not paper it, but he simply said it in her presence, right? And she accepted it, in other words, she did not object to this arrangement, then ultimately, again, ibdak suvasa, she goes out and she gives up her rights to any subsequent or to any additional ksuva payment. Wonderful. All right, everyone, we'll stop over here for today. Wishing everyone a wonderful day.